Welcome, everybody. I hope you're all well and you're here for Philosophy and Conspiracy Theories. This is a webinar that we have organized especially for the Philosophy Matters campaign. The Philosophy Matters campaign is organized by the British Philosophical Association and intends to promote events and activities that show how philosophy matters to different aspects of our life. This particular event is sponsored by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. So we definitely thank the Institute for enabling us to have with us today some amazing speakers. And it's a very interdisciplinary session for today. So my name is Lisa Bortolotti, and I'm Professor of Philosophy at the University of Birmingham and the University of Ferrara. And our first speaker for today will be U-Wen Low. And U-Wen Low is a colleague of mine here at the University of Birmingham. And I'm very pleased to have him here because he is together with Kathleen, myself, and some other colleagues, part of the project that we've got together on storytelling, film, and conspiracy theories that you will hear a lot more about later. So U-Wen is Assistant Professor of Public Religion here at the University of Birmingham and is interested in ways of applying religious studies to daily life in practical, meaningful ways. And he's an expert on the Book of Revelations and on the interplay between post-colonial thinking and Pentecostalism. So U-Wen, I give you some time to tell us all about conspiracy theories.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. Let me just share my screen and we can kick this off. Excellent. Well, hopefully that's working for everyone. If not, speak now or forever hold your peace. So yeah, as Lisa mentioned, I'm part of the film, storytelling, and conspiracies, or some configuration of those words together group. And we have a Substack. So if you'd like to follow our updates, please have a look at that. In effect, this is a group of philosophers, theologians, biblical scholars, and film scholars coming together to ask some questions about conspiracy theories, how they affect daily lives, how they play out through the way that we do narratives in day-to-day, and promises to be something really interesting and quite a lot of fun, and hopefully with some really practical outcomes as well. So let me begin by asking some questions about the Bible. Why the Bible? Why me, right? Why are you here for a philosophy talk and hearing from a biblical scholar? Well, I think it's fairly safe for us to say that religion continues to be important in the lives of people. Many of us here, and especially many listening, will probably be living in the Western world or the global North, or whichever configuration you'd like to use, where secularism continues to increase year on year. That doesn't mean that religion stops being important for lots of people, not least in, of course, the global South, but also still here in the Western world or in the North. And so we need to keep thinking through the way that religion and ideas to do with religion affect the way that people live their lives. And of course, I've got a little note there to think that the whole world should be secular, could be considered quite a kind of colonial viewpoint. So I'll let you have a think about that one yourself. Many of us have as well, looking in the news even today, have seen that religious nationalism, often sort of extreme religious views alloyed together with far-right, alt-right thinking, has become increasingly a problem for many locales around the world. And I wonder if we might be able to apply some of this thinking, the ideas around conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking into understanding this a little bit better. And of course, the biblical text itself is quite interesting for a number of reasons, which I'll unpack in a second. And I wonder if it works both ways, that if we learn to understand the biblical text a little better, whether this might give us some transferable tools, which we can apply in the way that we think about conspiracy thinking, and vice versa. How can the tools that exist from the field of philosophy that think about conspiracy or conspirational ideation be used to understand the biblical text a little bit better? So a recent study from Stockhammer and Bortolotti found very intriguingly, actually, that in the Western world, religiosity was positively correlated with belief in conspiracy and conspiracy theories, although curiously not for non-Western countries. I'm sure many of you who are listening have encountered some of these conspiracy theories yourself, and you'll probably know that a lot of them have got religious and indeed biblical foundations in many different ways. Some of the work that has been done shows quite clearly that biblical texts have been used fairly extensively for the creation of certain conspiracy theories, and indeed an attitude of biblical literalism has been found in some studies to contribute towards religious nationalism and conspiracy thinking. And what I'd like to suggest is that the Bible and other religious texts can and are often used as raw material from which conspiracy theories can be generated, which is a little bit scary, but also quite fascinating in many different ways. Now, of course, if you're familiar with the Bible, you'll know that the Bible itself contains conspiracy and conspiracy theories of many different kinds. I'll talk about the stolen body theory in just a moment. But of course, we see literal conspiracies written into the text, and they play themselves out in different ways. So there are conspiracies to depose governments, to assassinate kings, to do all of these different things. A big part of my work deals with apocalyptic literature. And one of the ways that biblical scholars have been thinking about apocalyptic literature is as coded language designed to help religious minorities or people who feel under oppression to make a stand or give them impetus in combating oppressive governments. So the stolen body theory, some of you may have seen it before. Basically, in the last book of Matthew, the first gospel that we encounter in the New Testament, it talks a little bit about this idea that Jesus's body was reportedly stolen by Jesus's disciples, and then fabricated. A whole conspiracy was fabricated to make it seem as if he was alive. So the writer of Matthew's gospel is clearly aware of this conspiracy theory and is addressing it already, saying, well, we know there's a conspiracy theory that Jesus wasn't actually resurrected and that we fabricated this whole thing. Well, this is not the case. This is what actually happened. So there's sort of an apologetic, if you like, for that addresses this conspiracy theory written into the Bible itself, which is fascinating, right? This idea that the story had perhaps gained enough traction that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew felt that it needed to be addressed. Now, conversely, of course, the opposite may be true, that by giving this conspiracy airtime, all of a sudden, this is now something that exists in the minds of those who are hearing this gospel for the first time. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Then, of course, we come on to talking about oppression and persecution. Now, the Bible is not a single monolithic text. It's 66 different texts, depending on which tradition you sit within, of course. And, of course, kind of used by different faith traditions in different ways, but a number of texts that have been put together along religious themes. And the idea is that quite a number of these themes actually address situations of threat, oppression, persecution, or perhaps, as some of my colleagues here think, the idea of persecution, i.e. that people who live within religious communities feel persecuted. They may not actually be persecuted. They may feel persecuted and act accordingly. Anyhow, when you feel like you're being persecuted and under oppression and under threat and surveillance, well, one of the best ways to plot against those who are doing these things to you, and indeed to avoid scrutiny, or at least divest some attention away from yourself, is to use conspiracy-like language or to use coded language, right? One or the other. It's a very useful tactic. We see it in situations of resistance all around the world still to today. And sometimes, and this can do a number of different things, right? It can be used to encourage resistance. It can be used to encourage people to believe in hope, i.e. that God will come, that there is a conspiracy by God, for example, who will come and liberate his people. All of these different things can be used to give people hope, build the community up, strengthen the community and sort of safeguard against external or internal threats. Of course, one of the problems for communities like this is that they are often facing internal threat as well as external threat. And so within the language, there is a huge amount of exclusivity, right? Of creating a strong in-group of people who, by and large, believe the same thing, because if you don't believe the same thing as us, you're a threat, because you might sell us to the authorities, for example. So a very clear way of thinking about it would be that this idea of, in the New Testament, you have this small group called the Christians, who call themselves the Christians later on, who are effectively followers of Jesus, who start out from Judaism and form a breakaway cult. They're worried because they're being persecuted in their minds by the Jewish folk, but they're also under threat from Rome, who a few decades later come in and destroy Jerusalem. So there's a strong need for this community to find ways to hide, to go without being surveilled, to protect its own unity, and to ensure that it is not under threat either from without or from within. And you can see then how this plays itself out into language that lends itself towards generating conspiracy theories. You have very vivid imagery, right, used to disguise a particular set of ideas. So instead of talking about these evil, oppressive kings that you're being faced with, you might talk about these strange beasts that wear crowns. You might talk about a beast that comes from the ocean when you're talking about the oppressive power of Rome, rather than just say Rome, because doing so will get you killed. And the other thing that these religious communities are trying to do, of course, is to say, well, God is on our side, right? We will win because we are good and because God is on our side. And so there's always this very strong idea that our enemies are utterly evil. They are beyond redemption. They will be killed. And so we are people of good. We must all think a certain way in order to bring about these events of the apocalypse and therefore secure victory for God. So, because texts in the Bible are used to combat oppression using coded language, and often this coded language is not fully explained, well, that gives modern conspiracy a lot of starting points where you can generate conspiracy. You can take this coded language and try and apply it into the 21st century, or even, sort of 14th century, 15th century, and generate talk about whatever you like. We see, for example, apocalyptic ideas and apocalyptic conspiracy all the way through human history, from the writing of the Book of Revelation all the way through to today. And many of you will be familiar with some of these language markers. 666 is the famous one, or the mark of the beast, the so-called Antichrist. By the way, the word Antichrist does not appear in the Book of Revelation. Fun fact for you for today. If you take nothing else out of my talk today, you could take that. Yeah, and lots of ideas and conspiracies and sort of intellectual effort go into deciphering all of these ciphers and saying, oh, well, clearly then this person is the mark of the beast, or this person is the Antichrist, or this person is Satan, all of these things. And I'm sure you've seen that in recent times. Most recently, the one I've seen quite a lot of is, of course, this idea of the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine being the mark of the beast. What then do we do? Well, the suggestion from our project is that we can start drawing on a number of different ideas that already exist, some really good work that's been done in the philosophical space to combat some of these conspiracies and to rehabilitate folk who have got conspirational beliefs. I think this is particularly pressing for scholars of religion and religious who work in faith traditions, because many of us are quite closely connected to faith communities. And as we've seen, there can often be quite a large number of folk within faith communities who do subscribe to all kinds of curious, shall we say, or different conspiracy theories, and who are quite often very adamant about them. And they build up a sort of critical mass within the religious community, and it can begin to distort the way that things operate. So there's a very real, very clear need for us to find ways to assist people within faith communities to deal with these issues in healthy ways, right? So how do we then start weaving all of these things together? And you can see what I've done is done a little bit of reading in the philosophical literature to start thinking about ways that might be really helpful. As mentioned, in the biblical space, we talk about this idea of apocalyptic literature being resistance literature. Well, that tells us something. What that does is it helps us to understand that these people who believe in conspiracy theories or who subscribe strongly to ideas about apocalypse and apocalyptic are people who feel as if they are under threat, who are feeling a bit of oppression for whatever reason. Again, they may not actually be, but nevertheless, if you feel a particular way, you will respond accordingly, right? So work by people like Bortolotti suggests that actually, let's move away from placing pressure on the individual, and indeed, we need to reshape an entire environment. That's really helpful, right? If you're part of a faith community who is thinking about these issues, who have these people within, who as part of your community, you might not want to single people out and say, you need to change. Instead, there are other interventions that we can do all around the place that help change the entire environment. Similarly, other work suggests that, for example, conspiracy theories have got very clear purposes, right? To help people, to boost ego, to help rationalize certain beliefs, to give them meaning and purpose. Well, within the faith community, that suggests a failure of imbuing purpose. What can we do to help people discover more meaning and purpose within their faith community? And of course, this idea from Sullivan, Bissett, Ishino, and Bortolotti that this whole idea of being someone who believes in conspiracy theory does not necessarily come out of defective thinking, right? There's nothing wrong with these people, right? If to believe in this way, which means that we don't write them off, right? We don't exclude them from the community. In fact, indeed, we need to find ways to bring them in and continue to work with them. I also suggest then that one of the things that we can start thinking about is the way that we talk about evidence, particularly from the perspective of biblical texts. Many of us deal quite strongly with things like archaeological and material culture evidence. How do we start using this and bringing this into more popular discourse to help people understand this? How do we start to understand the mechanisms that underpin belief construction, right? Where do people's ideas come from, particularly with regard to conspiracy theories and in conversation with religious texts? How do we work with these ideas together? And then, of course, here I've written down, how do we help people to articulate what they're feeling, their senses of oppression, and to engage with these things in healthy ways? Obviously, then holistic approaches are needed. There are a number of things that we can do, but overall, it is a broader set of ideas that need to shift, right? So here are some things that we might do. We might want to think about promoting literacy of the sacred texts. Many people who grow up within faith communities are not very literate in their chosen sacred text for a number of reasons. How do we help improve that? Is there a need for us to gatekeep who has authority and who is allowed to provide knowledge within communities? What happens if we bring a range of interpretive approaches together? And one of the best ways for us to do that, of course, is by developing diversity. How do we encourage preaching which addresses these issues? Where do people's sources of insecurity and oppression stem from? And how do we keep building purpose and cohesion within different community settings? And then a final set of thoughts here, which is some further avenues for us to explore. What does the Bible itself do in terms of generating conspiracy theories and conspirational thinking? How does the Bible actually address these, right? And does it do so in ways that are meaningful and effective? And if so, how can we borrow from them? What can biblical texts contribute towards building a healthy epistemic environment? How do we move away from popular misinterpretations of the text and start encouraging people to do critical thinking always a scary thought for a faith leader, but how do we encourage people to do critical thinking well within our faith communities? And then, of course, this sort of two-way conversation. Are there tools that exist within the realm of biblical studies that we can adapt into this project, and vice versa? What already exists out there, and I'm sure we'll hear from some more of this today, that we can adapt to bring into conversation with the Bible, religious ideas, faith communities, faith traditions, in order to better understand what's going on, and in doing so, be able to develop tools in a healthy way that help folk. So we're just at the beginning of this project. There's a long way to go, but we are beginning these conversations to start seeing how they will all come together. So thank you all very much for coming along, and I will stop there.
Thank you so much, U-Wen. That was fantastic. Very concise, but comprehensive, actually, look at what you're doing with conspiracy theories in your field. And we're moving on to something quite different now. So again, we're very, very pleased to have Joseph Pierre with us today. He has contributed to a number of philosophical projects on conspiracy theories, also the one by Emma that U-Wen was mentioning. So Pierre is a health sciences clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California. He has extensive clinical experience working with people diagnosed with psychotic disorders and substance use disorders and other things as well. But he has research interests, including schizophrenia, delusions, delusion-like beliefs, hallucinations, and voice hearing, which bring him really close to philosophy as well. So we are extremely pleased to have him with us today, and also really happy that is going to tell us maybe something that concerns is a very, very new book just published by Oxford University Press, which is called False. So Joe, back to you.
Sorry, Joe, you're muted.
Yes, just noticed that. All right, well, thank you so much for inviting me. So as stated, I'm going to be talking a little bit about conspiracy theories from the perspective of a psychiatrist who has a strong interest in delusions and delusion-like beliefs. Well, let's see here. No conflicts of interest, but as Dr. Bortolotti mentioned, I am trying to sell my book to all of you. So I've been working on this book on false beliefs for some time. I think I started in 2001. And so happy to say that it was just published by Oxford University Press this past month. So my academic work in conspiracy theories has really focused around 4 questions. So I'll briefly talk about each of the 4 questions and try to leave you with my sense of an answer. The first one is easy, relatively easy. What is a conspiracy theory? But I think it's important to start with that question because, in fact, unlike something like delusions, which has a kind of sanctioned definition in psychiatry thanks to the DSM, there is no sanctioned one official definition of conspiracy theory. So I will just leave you with the one that I use in my work, in part because that will segue into some other thoughts I have about conspiracy theories. So I like to say that conspiracy theories reject authoritative accounts of reality in favor of some plot involving a group of people with malevolent intent that is deliberately kept secret from the public. So you can see that this definition kind of has 2 parts. It has a negation, a rejection of authoritative account, and then an embrace of a conspiratorial counter-narrative. There are many other ways of defining conspiracy theory, but this is the one that I use. So next, why do people believe in conspiracy theories? Well, I always like to participate in these interdisciplinary sessions because the reality is that many different disciplines have been looking at conspiracy theories for some time. And now I do want to say that when Lisa and others invited me to the university there in Birmingham a couple of years ago, it was really fun for me because I don't get a lot of chance to talk about conspiracy theories among psychiatrists. It's not quite our domain. So it was really fun to talk to people from different disciplines, and arguably it's one of the few times that as an academic, I felt like I was among my people, with shared interests. So very fun to do that. And I'm also not a researcher in the sense of being an experimentalist. Years ago, I used to be involved in clinical trials and schizophrenia. But these days, my quote unquote research is more, I think, along the lines of thinking and thought experiments. So I do like to think of myself as a sort of honorary philosopher. But anyway, if we look at the research from a psychological perspective, there are a long laundry list of what I often call cognitive quirks or psychological quirks that are associated with a greater propensity for conspiracy theory belief. So this is a short list of them: needs for certainty or closure, needs for uniqueness, certain biases like hypersensitive agency detection, the idea that things have a sort of defined external cause, or perhaps there's a sort of higher order being or forces that are directing world events. Something that psychologists call bullshit receptivity. This is like an actual validated concept. And then using intuitive thinking at the expense of analytical thinking. So what I say about this kind of research, however, is that we often, I think, make the mistake of, because there's these psychological quirks, we think, okay, well, someone who's a conspiracy theorist is somehow mentally ill or delusional or, some other, insert your favorite pejorative. And so the point that I like to make here is, number one, these are quantitative differences, right? We all have needs for uniqueness. It's just that quantitatively, on average, they tend to be higher, that need, among people who have a higher propensity for conspiracy theory belief. Another point important to make is that most of us have at least one conspiracy theory belief. Polls have consistently shown that well over the majority of the population across the planet embrace at least one conspiracy theory. So I think, despite the sort of framing of this kind of research, I don't think the right way to think of conspiracy theory belief is necessarily through a pathological lens or by othering people as these, sort of crazy conspiracy theory tinfoil hat wearing folks. So a paper I wrote some years ago offers a kind of different perspective. At that time, I was really talking about two components, and I called this the socio-epistemic model. I've changed this a little bit now, and I tend to include three components, which happen to be the subtitle of my book. The three components are mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. So a little bit of alliteration there to help memorize the three M's. So briefly, I'll talk about these. When I talk about mistrust, I'm talking about epistemic mistrust. This is the idea that people mistrust in information and informational sources. And back to my definition, which is that two-part definition of conspiracy theories, we're often talking about mistrust in authoritative sources of information, mainstream sources of information, institutions of scientific authority, and that sort of thing. There can be a variety of different causes of that mistrust. Some of the causes might be earned, right, through trust violations, through history of, let's say, racist behavior that has inspired mistrust in certain cultural or subcultural groups. But there could also be more clearly pathological mistrust, people who are indeed suspicious or prone to paranoia and that sort of thing. So there's not a single cause of mistrust, and it can vary on a continuum of more rational, justified to less so. Misinformation is the second component, and so what I propose is that when we are mistrustful of authoritative sources of information, we then become vulnerable to the ubiquitous misinformation that's out there in the world, offering these conspiratorial counter-narratives. And to understand that vulnerability, we have to understand some psychological concepts, and we also have to understand some basics about how the internet works. So I think these have become household names, the idea that we all have confirmation bias. This is the tendency to embrace information that supports what we believe and to reject information that refutes it. So this cartoon, I think, always offers the best way of understanding confirmation bias, right? A guy gets on the computer, he says, I'm going to do my own research to find the real truth. And he clicks on literally the first thing that agrees with what you already believe. And he says, bingo. And so in the digital environment where people are looking for answers, they are also susceptible to falling into echo chambers. which doesn't just mean you're cloistered and you don't see other views. It really means you're in a sort of cultural environment where the one view is sort of promoted and others are rejected. There's also filter bubbles that occur within digital architectures that steer us to information that the algorithms, quote unquote, think that we want to see. So basically our search patterns reinforce similar search patterns so that we're steered towards information. So I talk about this being confirmation bias on steroids. And we also know from information science research these days that fake news or false news tends to spread farther, wider, faster than the boring old truth. And so the third component, motivated reasoning, kind of takes confirmation bias a step further. It's not just how we look at or don't look at information. This motivated reasoning refers to once we're actually examining information, how we then process it. So this is a kind of post-encounter experience we have with information that, similar to confirmation bias, tends to make us say, well, if this information supports what I believe ideologically and through my group affiliations, which are often political, then I think that the quality of the information is really, really good. But if the information refutes what I believe, then I can dismiss it because the quality is bad. And so I'm sure there must be some similarity in the UK, but here in the US, this is why conservatives think Fox News is great and CNN is terrible, but liberals think the opposite, right? So that's what motivated reasoning is all about. Couple other cartoons that are great illustrations of motivated reasoning, right? So this is a kind of philosopher here, right? He says, if P is false, I will be sad. I do not wish to be sad. Therefore, P is true. Right? So you're rejecting information. Here's another nice illustration. So some friends are sitting at dinner. One of them says, that's strange. I remember it differently in a way that aligns with my worldview and casts me in a positive light. All right. Oh, and this is one more cartoon. That basically the punchline is that the most scary thing that we could tell a child as a bedtime story is that we are capable of justifying anything to ourselves, which I think goes a long way to understanding politics today, certainly here in the US. Okay, so let me go on then and talk about question number 3. This is something I talked about quite a bit during the conference 2 years ago. How can we separate conspiracy theories from delusions? Are they the same? Are they different? When I worked with Lisa and Dr. Sullivan-Bissett, had the opportunity to publish a couple different papers that address this concept. Here's one. This is another in the recently published Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Delusion. So I think that delusions and conspiracy theories can be reliably distinguished, albeit sort of roughly. There, of course, could be exceptions. There could also be overlap where people could have both delusions and conspiracy theories. But I think if we think about them in terms of conviction, that offers one clue. Delusions, by definition, are fixed and sort of unassailable. People hold them with unassailable conviction. But conspiracy theories are just theories, right? This is the just asking questions part of belief. So somebody could say, well, I'm kind of interested in this theory. I think it's likely, but not necessarily holding it with delusional intensity. Another one is falsity. Delusions, by definition, are false, although it certainly happens to be the case that some beliefs are not falsifiable, and yet we think of them as delusions. But generally speaking, the concept of a delusion is that it's known with reasonable certitude that the belief is false. For conspiracy theories, we often think of them as conspiratorial in part because of their low likelihood and their lack of evidence, but conspiracy theories are not by definition false. And of course, conspiracy theorists often tell us, well, but sometimes conspiracies really happen. And of course, that's true. Conspiracies do really happen. This is a big one for me as a clinician. I think that when we focus on delusions and when they become most impairing, it's often because they have a self-referential component. The belief is about the believer, right? If I'm paranoid, it's because I feel like I'm in danger. If I'm grandiose, it's because I feel that I'm, a genius or I have a special connection to God. That's not really what conspiracy theories are about. They're not typically beliefs about the believer. They're beliefs about the world. Again, realizing that sometimes there can be some overlap. And as I say, that is one of the key components that determines whether or not a belief is shared or not. So I like to often say, and in segueing from U-Wen's talk, there are many, many people on the planet who believe that there might be a Messiah who's coming, right? The second coming of Christ. So it would be easy for me to find Confederates who share that belief. But if I told you that I was the second coming of Christ, that would probably be a tougher sell, right? So that goes back to the idea that self-referentiality is often more of a hallmark of delusion and often something where we lose Confederates who share a belief. And then rationale. The rationale for delusions is often based on so-called anomalous experiences, that is, inner experiences that are happening within our heads. So if I think I'm the Messiah, it's because I'm hearing God tell me that I'm the Messiah, right? That's what I call faith and subjectivity or subjective experience. Whereas conspiracy theories, typically the evidence and the rationale is not an internal experience. It's, I read it on this website, right? Or I saw it on Fox News, or Donald Trump told me that the election was stolen, right? So the rationale is information that's out there in the world. That's why I think misinformation is an important component. And finally, what drives action based on these beliefs? Delusions, we often, people, when they act on delusions, they do it because of self-referentiality, right? The belief is about me, and if there's a threat or something, I have to do something about it for my own personal well-being. Whereas conspiracy theories, when people act on those, I would argue it's not so much self-referentiality, but something I call self-relevant consequentiality, right? The election's being stolen, and therefore I must march on the Capitol, even though the conspiracy theory wasn't about me personally. Okay, so moving on to the last question, kind of related to what I just said about threat and action. When are conspiracy theory beliefs pathological? When do they lead to violence, and can they be treated, or can we intervene? So for this is another paper I wrote recently on this topic, but I tend to think that that a quantitative model can help us understand this. We oftentimes think of things as black and white, yes and no. Are they pathological? Are they not? And psychology really looks at, for example, delusions in a different way. We quantify beliefs or delusional beliefs or beliefs in general based on things like our degree of conviction or our degree of preoccupation, that sort of thing. So I like to talk about this idea of quantifying ideological commitment. And before I tell you about that, I want to define ideology. For me, ideology is a sort of system of beliefs that includes factual beliefs, right? So QAnon has to do with the idea that there's this deep state that's trafficking children. So these are factual beliefs. But ideologies often typically include values. Values are also types of beliefs, but they're beliefs about what's important, right? So trafficking children is really important. That's a key issue. And also morals, which are also beliefs, but specific beliefs about what's right or wrong or good and bad. So, so I believe that the deep state is trafficking children, and the value is, I think that's really important, and the moral belief is that this is really wrong. Okay, so with that idea of ideology, I talk about this sort of quantitative belief, quantitative way of understanding belief or ideological commitment, which includes these different stages. And the stages are determined by the cognitive dimensions of belief that I mentioned, like conviction, preoccupation, emotional investment. They're based on quantitative differences in epistemic mistrust and the extent to which one believes in misinformation. They're based on group affiliation, moral judgment, the fusion of belief and identity, and that self-relevant consequentiality that I mentioned. So I have this sort of stage-wise model, right? It's going down because this is supposed to be illustrative of falling down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory belief. The non-believer, the fence sitter, the true believer, the activist, and then for some cycling back and becoming apostates. So real quickly, before I finish up, I'm going to touch upon these stages. So the non-believer is someone who has low ideological commitment. I think U-Wen, there might be some very interesting parallels with religious belief here. I like to say that the healthy way of holding, the mentally healthy way of holding a belief, whether it's a religious belief or otherwise, is with what I irreverently call the Holy Trinity of truth detection. And the Holy Trinity is those 3 bullet points there. Cognitive flexibility, meaning I'm able to change my mind if I'm presented evidence to the contrary. I'm also able to listen to what other people's beliefs are. So you can have, for example, religious faith, but you can also coexist with other people who have different faiths, and like that's okay, and we can still, have a cookout or a beer or what have you, right? So that's cognitive flexibility. Intellectual humility, which simply means I accept that it's possible that I'm not right about every single thing, right? Very hard for some people to have that kind of humility. And then analytical thinking, which I alluded to earlier. I think people often misunderstand analytical thinking. They think it means that someone has taken advanced statistics or you're really smart or something like that. That's not what analytical thinking means. Analytical thinking simply means that when we encounter information, we kind of slow down, we pump the brakes, and we say, I wonder if this information might be wrong, rather than immediately saying, ooh, I like this, it supports what I want to believe, I'm going to share it, and this is great information. So that's sort of the non-believer. The non-believer isn't someone who doesn't believe. It's simply someone who's not firmly attached to an ideological belief per se, and they're able to hold the belief that they have or the faith that they have with these different qualities. So contrast that with the fence sitter, right? The fence sitter is epitomized by that phrase, just asking questions, because the fence sitter starts to have epistemic mistrust. They're starting to turn away from conventional sources, and they're starting to look out there for in the world for other information. So when I think about this as a psychiatrist, I'm often thinking about, is there an opportunity for intervention? How might we work with someone? And fence sitters in, for example, vaccine hesitancy research are known as the low-hanging fruit of intervention, right? Obviously, if someone's looking for answers and they're not firmly committed to something, that's someone for whom you can get in there and really look at different theories, hypothesis testing, and help people choose ones that might be more justified. But the next step then is the true believer, right? So the true believer holds a belief with strong conviction and preoccupation. Cognitive dissonance is the idea that when our beliefs conflict with reality, there's a certain tension that arises. And we know that oftentimes what we do when we encounter that uncomfortable tension is we double down on the belief, or we move the goalposts so that we can then hold the belief. So true believers tend to have a belief as a sort of sometimes cognitive defense where they resolve that anxiety. And usually the research on cognitive dissonance shows that the more time, the more energy, the more you've invested in this belief system, the more unlikely you are to abandon it, right? Because you have spent all that energy. And so for these folks who become true believers, what often happens is there's a fusion of belief and identity, right? If you think about how we define ourselves, whether it's our profession or we're parents or what have you, we also often base our our identity on belief, right? Whether it's our political party or religious beliefs or what have you. And when that happens, I think we can then become vulnerable to threats to our identity or existential threats, where we think, well, this person's attacking my belief system, and I am my belief system, therefore this person is attacking us. And I think that potentially can be dangerous, as we'll see in the next stage. The next stage is what I call activism. This stage model is sort of borrowed from some research on so-called radicalization and terrorism, but I purposely chose a more neutral term. I'm not trying to pathologize or say that this is a bad thing, right? And so I choose activism because I think activism is often a positive force of change. Nonetheless, activists are people for whom the belief is not adequate. I have to do something about the belief. This is where that self-relevant consequentiality comes into play. So the guy who was sort of essential to the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, right? He thought that there was this, Hillary Clinton was running a child trafficking operation in the basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., and because he thought that was such a terrible, important thing, he himself was a father of two, he said, well, I have to go self-investigate, quote unquote, right? So that's self-relevant consequentiality. I remember the first night of the conference a couple of years ago, we had this sort of debate over dinner about, I struggle with this idea that people need to stand up for what they believe. I often feel like actually people should be standing down from what they believe, right? Because belief is often faith-based and not based on evidence, and we should in fact be more cognitively flexible rather than saying, you know, I want to fight for what I believe. I'm always a little nervous about that phrase. So anyway, so for activists who feel like they need to do something about their belief, particularly when it then becomes a defensive maneuver in the face of existential threat, that's where there's a potential for violent behavior or non-normative behavior. And then finally, we know from research on people who have been part of so-called cults and such, that there are people who turn away from being a true believer and activist and then go back to the non-believer stage. That often occurs when cognitive dissonance is stretched to a breaking point. More often it occurs when there's some disillusionment with the cause or the leader of the cause. And sometimes it occurs when people run into trouble and have legal repercussions. From terrorism research, we know that one of the ways that you can get people to become apostates or to help them along that path is to pair them with other apostates, right? People who have left movements and said, hey, you know, that was really a dangerous thing, and now I feel better, and, you know, that sort of thing. And keeping in mind that you have to help people reintegrate with society, I think is a key intervention. So that's basically my talk, kind of a whirlwind through a number of different topics. And yeah, I'll end with again, encouraging you to check out my book, which is about not just conspiracy theories. There's a chapter on that, but it's really about false beliefs much more broadly. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was fantastic. So we are gathering lots of interesting questions, and we will get to them in a moment. But let's hear the final presentation first. So to give time to Kathleen and now to talk about their exciting research. So Kathleen is my colleague at the University of Birmingham. She's a research fellow interested in rationality across everyday and psychiatric cases. She co-leads the project that we talked about on film storytelling and conspiracy theories. And she has also some interesting work in an interdisciplinary setting on delusion, for instance, on delusions of infestation with entomologists. Nele Van de Mosselaer is assistant professor at the philosophy department in Tilburg, and she's interested in how the boundaries between reality and fiction are blurred in digital game experiences. So she's part of the Game Philosophy Network, which I find super interesting. And she co-designed a video game, which I started playing. And we will put the link in the chat if you're interested. But I let Kathleen and Nele tell us about conspiracy theories.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, me and Nele are going to talk a little bit about comparisons between believing in a conspiracy and kind of communities coming together and fandoms who are interested in fictions together. And Nele's going to talk about video games in particular. And so, yeah, U-Wen mentioned it earlier, and as did Lisa. This is part of this interdisciplinary group or project that we have going about film, storytelling, and conspiracy, where we're really zoning in on the kind of role of fiction and narrative and story in bringing people to believe these various things that they believe, which can often be quite bizarre. Okay, Nele? So as I mentioned in the first part, we're going to go through passing between me and Nele, talking about parallels that we see between engagement with conspiracies and engagement with works of fiction. And then a little bit later on, we'll talk about the philosophical upshots and conclusions that we think we can draw from this. So firstly, Joe touched on these a little bit, but the empirical research has found associations between believing conspiracies and having a hypersensitive agency detection. So this is the idea that there's someone or something or some sort of force behind the events and the things that we see happen in the world. And so there's this aversion to accepting these kind of explanations which are not as satisfying, which are like, well, it's just a coincidence, you know, tend to not to think it's coincidence. And there's also mention of not accepting that it's just shit happens, that sometimes some explanations just shit happens. So we find that conspiracy theorists tend not to kind of be satisfied with those kind of explanations, and instead are much more likely to see agency of some sort, of someone being behind the events that we see. Closely related to this is this illusory pattern perception, where again, in events that might be random, really, again, this kind of shit happens idea, they will just see these patterns and be sure that they can see patterns which are not really there. You can even see it in these random coin toss sort of experiments, where it's random, there are coin tosses, but they will see patterns, as associated with conspiracy beliefs. Seeking meaning and existential security. So believing in these kind of stories that conspiracy theories give can then give a sense of kind of having control and security, and giving people a sense of meaning in their lives, that it's not just that everything just happens and there are coincidences, but rather, especially if people have these existential needs for kind of good stories and explanations for why their lives are the way that they are, conspiracy theories might bring that. And finally, there's a link between belief in things like urban legends, the supernatural, paranormal, explanations, and belief in conspiracy theories. So again, there might be this kind of shared interest in kind of fictional stories for explaining certain phenomena. And just a nice quote, which I think summed up quite a lot of this kind of literature on the kind of empirical kind of biases here. Supporting conspiracy theories is strongly predicted by a willingness to believe in other unseen intentional forces, and an attraction to Manichaean narratives. So these grand narratives where you have these battles between good and bad. And then I hand over Nele now to talk a little bit about these kind of forces in fiction.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me. So I'm not researching conspiracy theories as such. I actually do research in the interpretation processes of video game players. And this is where I saw such interesting parallels. And that's what I want to talk about here. I have an example here. This is, as you can see, a picture of a forest. And in this forest, the sun hits the forest floor in a very particular fashion. Now, if we would see this in an actual forest, in reality, we wouldn't immediately assume that there is some agent who did this for us. This might have significance for us, but it would be strange to think that there is a correct meaning, right? Because there is no intention. We would be very likely to say that this is a coincidence, right? This is just due to where the sun is at that time of the day and what the shape of the trees is. But now imagine that I told you that this picture was actually taken within the virtual world of a video game. It is actually a virtual forest. What is interesting now is that this forest is an artifact if it is part of a video game. Artifact here just means that it is an object made by a human being, typically one of cultural or historical interest. But importantly, it's an object made by someone who had a certain intention. What that means is that if we encounter this in a video game players are very likely to ascribe special meaning to how the sun hits the floor here. Because we are thinking here, somebody designed this forest in that way. Somebody meant to communicate something to me with this. And this, of course, guides our interpretation of it. Video game players might think that there is treasure to be found there, and that's why the sun hits the floor in that specific spot. Or maybe we have to go there because a boss battle will be there, right? We know that the designer made this game for us. So there is literally an invisible, unseen force behind our experience of the video game world, the video game designer. And this guides how we interpret video game worlds. A very extreme example can be found in the game The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. At the end of this game, there was this kind of maze that you needed to go through. But every room in the maze was just circular with 4 doors. Only one of these doors was the correct door. If you picked any of the 3 other doors, you would just get sent back to the beginning of the maze. But in the circular room, there was not really an indication of which was the right door, except for one thing. In every room, there was an enemy called Phantom Ganon. And if you defeated Phantom Ganon, he dropped his sword in a very particular fashion. The sword would wobble for a bit and then fall in a specific direction. Players quickly discovered that you have to follow the hilt of the sword. Where the hilt of the sword is pointing, that's the door that you need to take to be able to exit the labyrinth in this part of the game. Now, what we see here is that in reality, it would be quite ridiculous to follow how an object falls to make decisions in our lives. But in a video game, this makes a lot of sense because in video games, there is no coincidence. There's no such thing as something that just happens, a mere event. Everything in a video game is a result of deliberate agency, namely the intentional agency of the designer.
So something else that we that might kind of explain the tone of attraction to conspiracy theories for some people is that the way that they are puzzles is fun. Basically, it's fun and it's entertaining, and there's some entertainment value in putting together all of these puzzle pieces. So it's a fun game, it's a puzzle, it's like a murder mystery where you're looking for clues throughout the way, and you're trying to kind of, as I say, put these puzzle pieces together. And the powerful thing here is the feeling of it and that it is fun. So there's some work about the aha moments that conspiracy theories might bring, is that once you kind of got these, all of these different puzzle pieces about the world and how the world works, and that there's one picture of this story of conspiracy or deception behind it, which kind of explains all of these different areas, and you put these pieces together and you find an extra clue and it fits into the wider puzzle, that these kind of aha moments feel really good and they feel good fun. And this probably links to the fact that having an explanation is calming and useful, and it's good to kind of have explanations for why things unfold in the ways that they do around you. And that basically these kind of feelings, this kind of thrill, or this kind of rush of putting puzzle pieces together can be part of what makes these often quite bizarre beliefs just a little bit too irresistible to not believe anymore, when it just makes so much sense when you take a step back and think, I've done a good job of putting all of these puzzle pieces together.
Yeah, and so again, we can see clear parallels with how video games are designed. Because of course, video games very often are designed as puzzles, and as puzzles specifically that we can solve, right? It would be a bad game design if there's a puzzle, but there's no solution. And this is something that also guides our interpretation of game worlds. Imagine finding a key in a video game, right? Then you know that there must be some kind of designed aha moment. There must be a moment in the game where you can use this key to solve a problem or enter a new room. You know the key is going to have use. Otherwise, the designer would not have put the key there. There must be some kind of clarity that you can achieve around the use or the function of this key. And this also leads to the fact that any problem we encounter in a video game as a player, we know that it is solvable. This also means that video game players often can be very, in their approach to game worlds, they can have a lot of trust. They can have a lot of tenacity when looking for solutions to problems because they know the solution will be designed into the game as well. This also means that players can be very stubborn when looking for solutions, when looking for that clarity when they encounter problems in video games. And once again, you can see an interesting example of this in an actual player community. Like I said, every problem in a video game is perceived as a solvable puzzle. And this led, in the case of the game Shadow of the Colossus, to a decade-long quest by players for the last secret in this video game. This last secret is described in Jacob Geller's YouTube video. It's a 20-minute YouTube video just about this one door in Shadow of the Colossus. It was a massive door somewhere in an arena in the game. It was a stone door, it had signs on it, but it could not be opened. So players became obsessed with this door. They wanted to figure out what was behind it, some treasure, some secret room. They needed to find a way to open this door. They couldn't find it by themselves, so they took to internet fora to discuss this. And this actually led to 562 pages of forum posts of people trying to figure out how to open this door. Somewhere along page 500, somebody says, well, we have all of these interesting theories now that haven't worked up until now. But did anybody try to do any of these things that we discussed in their 16th playthrough instead of their first one? In other words, theories became very, very far-fetched. And in the end, there was no secret at all. In fact, this door in the game was just an embellishment of the game world. It couldn't open at all. It was not even interactive. Interestingly, though, the community that partook in this quest still looks back on this quest as a very valuable search because they look back on it with nostalgia, and this community effort is something that they really enjoyed. Just striving towards clarity, even though it wasn't achievable, was still something they value.
Yeah, so another attraction to believing in a conspiracy might be the way that conspiracy theories meet social needs by bringing sense of community and a sense of belonging. So there's work showing that, especially if you feel that your social group is under some sort of threat, whether you are kind of the guys that you believe in are not the ones who are in political power at the moment, or you think that the group that you are a part of is kind of not really respected and is maligned and is oppressed by other people. And you feel the need to kind of like, bolster the sense of the community that you're a part of, and to preserve a sense of belonging. This might be something that brings people to believe in conspiracy theories. And then once this happens, once we have this kind of emboldening of the sort of group that you are in, it then obviously can further kind of structure your world, and you carry on, that carries on then being the source of how your social needs are met. We see that communities come together online to, in a really similar way to how Nele was describing, to pore over the details of certain things and to puzzle it out together. So loads of QAnon members will meet on 4chan and other forums, I think, to analyze various things, various speeches, but they will especially come together to analyze the transcripts of the speeches made by Donald Trump. And so they believe, members of QAnon believe, that there's this mysterious figure Q, who is a kind of secret figure, a mystery government insider somewhere, who is giving hints and telling them kind of what's going on, and they're trying to piece together what's going on in the deep state and these kind of trafficking rings and things that are going on. They're referred to as like Q drops, I think, that are clues in Donald Trump's speeches. And so they all come together and they all analyze the material that's put out there. And given the way that this is kind of such a shared endeavor, and it's kind of like these same theories are kind of brought up and added upon by all these different people online, it becomes really difficult to really differentiate kind of the different kind of types, the different kind of variations of a specific theory about what's going on, because they all build on each other, and also to pinpoint any of them to any particular single author, because it becomes such a shared endeavor online of puzzling it out.
And again, a lot of parallels to video game player communities. Video games can even be designed as community puzzles. An example of this is Animal Well. Animal Well is a game that contains many puzzles, and some of them very hard, like this one. What you see here is a kind of drawing that players could find in Animal Well, but it was clearly a puzzle, but players weren't sure what to do. So of course they started doing research, right? And they discovered this secret room where you can change the drawing. You can change every square in that frame to blue, red, or yellow. Once again, though, players didn't know what to change the drawing to. Then they discovered even another secret room below this one. And in this secret room, they found this 4x4 grid, which gave them an indication of what seems to be part of the drawing. Once again, though, players didn't quite know how to solve the puzzle. This didn't really help them. So once again, they took to internet discussion fora. What they discovered there is that, in fact, every player gets a different grid in their game. What they discovered was that every player gets one piece out of the 50 that you need to solve this puzzle in the game. So what you see here is 50 players online sharing the 4x4 grid that they found in their copy of Animal Well. And it was when they had collected all of these 50 puzzle pieces together that they finally could actually start solving the puzzle, which is something that, as a community, they succeeded in. They discovered that this is the drawing that you have to make in the game. This is the solution to the puzzle that no player by themselves could have found. In fact, ideally, you need 50 players to solve this puzzle. Interestingly, this is an example of intentional communal effort, right? The game designer wanted people to do this. But like I said, players often also do this spontaneously. One example of this, considering how players also do this for game stories, not only for game challenges, is Bloodborne. In Bloodborne, the story of the game is very vague. You have to look for it in item descriptions and in very vague dialogues between characters. So once again, what we see here is that players started doing their own research. They took to Reddit to kind of share their theories about character motivations and the fictional history of the game world of Bloodborne. And once again, this resulted in this kind of publication of the Pale Blood Hunt, a Bloodborne analysis by Reddit user Redgrave, 107 pages of purely fictional history of the game world based on Reddit research. This book is now very often seen as the canon. If anybody wants to know what the story of Bloodborne is, they refer to this particular book. Not only is this book the result of a communal effort of the community of fans surrounding Bloodborne, but it also further shaped new communities. What we see on Reddit now is that some people might disagree with Redgrave's interpretation, and they form their own community of people who try to prove that, in fact, this one character had another motivation to do what they did, right? So also here we see that players really engage in this kind of own research around game worlds as a community. Now, why have we been comparing video game players to conspiracy theorists here? And what are the philosophical upshots of this particular comparison? First of all, I want to say something about how we, and I mean in philosophy of fiction, think about belief and imagination. Interpreting reality is often seen as associated with forming beliefs, but fiction interpretation is associated with forming imaginings. What I mean with this is that when we try to make sense of reality, what we are trying to do is form beliefs. We try to form thoughts about what is actually the case. But when we interpret fictions like video games, nobody truly believes that there is a labyrinth somewhere that you need to navigate by going through one door, or that certain characters in Bloodborne have certain motivations. These are imaginings. It's kind of thoughts that we have about fictional worlds, worlds of which we know that it's not the real world. So by comparing video game players to conspiracy theorists, are we trying to say that conspiracy theorists are merely imagining the theories they believe in? No, that's not what we are trying to say. Rather, what we are saying here is that the strategies that are usually applied to constructing imaginings about fictional worlds are often applied to an interpretation of reality in conspiracy thinking. They are often applied to a formation of beliefs. Now, one important thing that we want to note here is that by themselves, these strategies can be appreciated for their aesthetics, right? They can be very valuable. They can be very fun. In fact, when we look at player communities, we often praise them for very far-fetched theories, for their tenacity when trying to solve puzzles that weren't even there to begin with, and for their communal efforts in doing so.
Yeah, so we're quite, big fans of looking at how these contexts of fiction show the good sides of these kind of processes, and the way that communities come together to solve big problems which could never have been solved independently is a great thing. And so we continue to think that we should, in worrying about conspiracy theories and maybe thinking about how we might tackle widespread uptake of conspiracy theories, bear in mind that maybe there's nothing wrong with these processes by themselves, and we should therefore be looking to work with these processes rather than against them. So look at how we can fulfill these needs that people have, these aesthetic needs and these psychological needs that stories often bring. And how can we fulfill them rather than ask people to kind of just not have them, kind of repress them, or just leave them unfulfilled? And we might also ask ourselves at a more kind of taking a step back and at the kind of a more group level or societal level, why is it that we are finding that a lot of people who have these needs, and we can't blame people for having these needs and exercising these fun processes of kind of decoding things, why is it that conspiracy theories are where people are finding fulfillment for these kind of processes? Can we offer people better alternatives than conspiracy theories for understanding the world and meeting these kind of needs? And also that there's this blurring when it comes to kind of conspiracy theories, and in the same way that there's blurring in kind of fictional canons as well, of claims about the world, of claims about how things are, with the values that are being embodied by the stories in each case. So, all of the people that come together around the fandoms of something like Star Wars or Star Trek or Harry Potter, they don't just argue about kind of facts of the matter, but they're interested in coming together because of the values and the themes and the moral ideas that are embodied by the stories. And similarly with conspiracy theories, there's a blurring, which makes it a really complicated picture, but there's this, fruitful, interesting blurring where sometimes, because we just believe in the values so much of something like transparency, people keeping each other safe, and clear communication of knowledge and who we trust and so on, that all of these values just mean so much to us that we can get caught up also in some of the claims that are being made as well. But in essence, it means that we should maybe start with the values that people are agreeing with and people are coming together to kind of decipher things about, and work with these processes in general rather than against them. I think there's one more, and yeah, and that concludes our talk. Thanks so much for listening to us.
Thank you so much, Kathleen and Nele. It was fantastic, really interesting comparisons. So we've got about 20 minutes for questions, and I'll just start by reading one that was for U-Wen, because we started with this talk. So this is from Carlen Smith. She says it's probably like more of a comment than a question. A useful study in South Africa would be to consider more direct modes of contact and the spread of conspiracy theories. One of the very big conspiracy theories doing the round on Telegraph and WhatsApp types of communications during the pandemic was that the COVID vaccine contained the DNA of the devil or the Antichrist. There was another variation on that. And Satan was building his army. And this theory definitely had a far more religious twist. It seemed to be very prevalent amongst more politically conservative people, although there were people from various other social environments who spread the theory. You know, she hadn't done any empirical study on this, but works on conspiracy theory. So would like your comment, U-Wen.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because one of the things that is, as you look at sort of the reception or the way that the text has been received and interpreted over the years, we see lots and lots of conspiracy theories that come out of the Book of Revelation, for example, right? So often what you get, or what we're fighting against in some ways, is hundreds of years of history of conspiracy, right? You know, the example I always give my undergraduates is that we like to think that Y2K was one of the big panics when everyone thought that the world was going to end. It might surprise a lot of people to know that 1499, in the year 1499, there was a huge amount of conspiracy panic about the world ending in the year 1500. And like I said, I think it's a lot to do with the idea that Revelation, because it's written in a coded way, it's using disguise, it's using very visual language that is intended to spark the imagination to fight against perceived oppression and injustice. Well, there are lots of tools in there that any sensible writer can use and twist and turn in order to develop conspiracy theories. And I'd be really surprised if we didn't see more conspiracies keep coming out of the Book of Revelation. And as we've heard from everyone actually today, one of the things about being a religious follower means that in many ways you're already, maybe not susceptible, that's not the right word, but there is already a tendency within you to accept certain things on faith, right? And to kind of develop a certain line of thinking, which means that perhaps you may be more vulnerable to conspiracy theories. But you know, I'm happy to hear if anyone else on the panel has anything to say about that.
Thank you. Yeah. Should we go to the question for Joseph next? So this is an anonymous attendee. I used to work in mental health, and particularly with patients who had treatment-resistant personality disorders. From a social care perspective, it was always really hard because we had one patient who had what was noted as delusion about people being otherworldly beings. But in society where religions like Scientologists exist, it was hard to justify their immediate caregivers agreeing that the patient was delusional, given that what we consider sane people are part of groups that could be considered cults with delusional thinking. How do we challenge this? Can anything be done? Joe, that's for you.
Great. Well, actually, one of my very first published papers back in, I think it was 2000 or 1999 or something like that, was about this very challenge about separating delusional thinking from religious beliefs. And I think that sort of, in a way, was emblematic to where my career ended up going academically, because I would often find myself thinking about that with patients. You know, what about this belief? Should it be considered a delusion? Should I, intervene as a mental health professional? And that's what sort of led me to those characteristics that I talked about in terms of distinguishing them. In mental health, as a psychiatrist, we don't typically tend to intervene unless someone is help seeking or, becomes someone who is brought to care, involuntarily because of some circumstance. So that aspect of, is the belief causing some distress, is sort of a key thing that might determine whether or not you're coming to see me. And then, as I said in my talk, the self-referential component, I think, is really key when we start thinking about, is this just a culturally sanctioned belief versus, is this something that we could think of as more pathological and consequential that we ought to intervene with? But I love thinking about those kind of situations. And of course, there is overlap. There are situations where people have sort of broad conspiratorial beliefs that are supported and shared out in culture, but then that belief is used to reinforce my own self-referential belief. Everyone believes there's a Messiah, therefore I am the Messiah, that kind of thing. But that's sort of the fun of clinical work, is that you have to make those calls all the time. And of course, what that means is you have to be knowledgeable about cultural belief. So the first question I typically ask patients when I'm trying to make that assessment is, why do you believe what you believe? In the book, I think I talk about this anecdote some years ago where this person was in the hospital, in part due to drug use, and was espousing all sorts of different conspiratorial beliefs about, the deep state and this sort of thing. And I asked that question. I said, where did you get this idea from? And this was before I had ever heard of this website called InfoWars, which I think we now all know what that website is. That was the first time I ever encountered it. So I got on there and I said, well, I can't call this person delusional because, here's the source material. So I think those are some of the things that can help guide us in that direction. Now, last quick comment is, the interesting thing is that there's mental health and mental illness. And in the tradition in mental health isn't necessarily to confine us to treating people with mental illness, right? We also treat the full spectrum. So you might very well benefit, for example, from psychotherapy, even though you're not mentally ill or delusional per se, right? If you've gone down the rabbit hole of QAnon and now you've estranged yourself from family and friends, and you have been out of work and you're upset, and this, the QAnon affiliation is just stirring up a lot of anger in you, that's somebody who might benefit from psychotherapy.
Yeah, that's a really nice
all in there. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so the next one from Valentina Cardella is for Kathleen and Nele. So why does no one want to identify themselves as a conspiracy theorist? There are very few people who accept the label. Even the authors of the most bizarre conspiracy theories, such as David Icke, don't admit to being conspiracy theorists. It seems that the label conspiracy theorist gives rise to a form of epistemic injustice. Why is it so? Is it something that has to do with the content of the belief or with the attitude of the speaker? For instance, his or her resistance to counter-argument?
I'll go first if that's okay, Nele. I just think that's a really interesting point and a really interesting idea. I think maybe there are some people who are happy to call themselves conspiracy theorists, but in a sort of, not ironic, but in a sort of to push back against what we might say is a little bit of a pejorative way of meaning conspiracy theorist, and thinking that calling somebody a conspiracy theorist is a political action in itself, to mean that they aren't listened to. And it's something that could easily be kind of then also incorporated into the kind of original conspiracy theory, like, well, yeah, of course, if I were onto something, everybody would start calling us conspiracy theorists. So sometimes with a little bit of kind of, so be it, overly accepting that I'm a conspiracy theorist. But obviously, because we think that there's a lot of genuine belief in these conspiracies, I think to think that someone is a conspiracy theory usually is to imply that they don't really believe it, but they think, no, I'm taking this very seriously. And I find possible questions of epistemic injustice here really, really interesting, where I too am interested in when it's unjust to just write someone off, because that, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, it might be that these kind of slight pejorative meanings are packaged into calling someone a conspiracy theorist, wherein we start thinking they just have no sensible capacities anymore for trying to figure out their own feelings in the world and so on, just because so far they have got bizarrely different answers to us, and that might not be right, and there might be all sorts of reasons and different experiences and feelings that person is dealing with, which has led to them believing how they believe. And that, to have all of that dismissed might mean that they are then annoyed by being called a conspiracy theorist. I think that's how they're being dismissed. I don't know if Nele has anything to add.
No, I think that was a very good reply, actually.
Cool. Let's get another one for U-Wen then. A very long time ago, this is an anonymous attendee, I did an MA on Shakespeare and gardeners, and I was rather struck by the story of Mary Magdalene mistaking Jesus for a gardener. I wonder, do these conspiracy-like ways of thinking in the Bible feed into our societal way of thinking about certain groups of people? And how do we deal with this?
It's a good question. And for my part, I don't necessarily want to come across as saying that the Bible itself causes prejudice. It just captures what's already there, right? And similarly with conspiracy. And I would argue that one of the reasons that the Bible gets used is because of its position as an authoritative faith text, right? If something that Plato had written was a religious text, then we would see similar conspiracies come out of Plato, for example, right? Maybe we all live in a cave with fires behind our backs or something. So, let's not just throw the Bible out completely, right? I do think that in terms of prejudicial or stereotypical thinking, perhaps is a better way of doing it. I mean, it's no different to any other sort of stereotypical thinking, where I think a lot of kind of self-reflection, self-awareness is helpful. Diversity and being exposed to different types of people and different groups of people, and sort of that self-awareness, openness to being questioned, that Joe sort of talked about right at the beginning of his talk as well, is all really important. But I think one thing that's helpful to acknowledge here is that it can be really difficult, right? Because often we do look for confirmation of our own beliefs, or alternatively, if we're discriminated against, that can actually cause us to further develop our own conspirational thinking. So, I won't use religion as an example. Let me use, being Chinese, right? Being Chinese, you kind of go around and you think, oh, everyone's fine with me. But then if one person says to you, oh, well, you go back to where you came from, and treats you a certain way, every time you get treated even slightly similar to that, it kind of echoes in your mind. Oh, is this person treating me this way because I'm racist, rather than because they're having a bad day, or I've done something or anything like that? So it can kind of amplify. A small interaction can become something quite big depending on how we dwell on it. So I'm sure that Joe is much more qualified to talk about this than I, but I'm sure there are many sort of cognitive ways that you can, develop and learn to do better with that.
Thank you, Wen. So maybe last question for everybody here. The role of the community in the kind of maybe development, but also maintenance of conspiracy theory beliefs. What do we think about that? Nele, maybe you want to start?
Well, I mean, not talking about conspiracy theorists in particular, because that's not my expertise, but definitely when forming theories, like I talked about in video games, that community is so important, not only to form new theories, but like I said, also because new communities are shaped based on which beliefs or imaginings you have and which you ascribe to. So I think that the feeling of community is so important to not only uphold beliefs that this community shares, but also to kind of break communities into smaller ones that then discuss each other's beliefs and also don't agree on everything, obviously.
I can offer a quick comment on that question. I mean, I would say that a conspiracy, by definition, is an act of a group of people. And therefore, conspiracy beliefs are by definition about social behavior. I would also say, I didn't have time to talk about in my talk, but what we know about conspiracy theories from political science, and I think is very relevant in politics today, is that conspiracy theories are often used by political leaders as disinformation, right? Intentional misinformation. And you could argue that one of the core purposes of furthering those kind of beliefs is to push us and them narratives, to create rifts within social groups, which again, I think can offer quite a bit of insight on what's going on in politics today.
Yeah, and I think it links a lot to what you were saying about identity as well, right? So sometimes some beliefs that we have, they don't need to be conspiracy theories or they don't need to be religious beliefs, but when they become important to us, they, you know, it is something that we identify with, but also they kind of tell us which social groups we want to associate with and which ones we don't. One of our attendees was asking about films. So he was saying, you know, we had films in the title of the project, but we didn't talk about films. So maybe U-Wen and Kathleen want to say a little bit more about the project and how films come in.
Yeah, so I can mention, so I'm co-lead along with Dr. Elena Schemp, who unfortunately just cannot join us today, but she was going to join us, but she can't join us. And she brings this expertise in film and film scholar. And we're really interested in these films that kind of straddle these genre boundaries, where they are to some extent, you know, just fictional storytelling, and they're just coming up with a story and they want it to be kind of obviously emotional and hard hitting and memorable and so on. But then also some of them are also explicitly and obviously dealing with real events. And so there are some kind of like mockumentary, documentary type things. And there are these films like JFK, which is about a conspiracy about the assassination of JFK. And, you know, what's interesting is that even though everyone's very explicit about everything that's happening, you know, they'll be like, well, obviously JFK was assassinated and there's all these different explanations. This is one conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory, but we're making a film about it. But it might be that nevertheless, these kind of techniques, or just the way that a story can become so emotionally felt when it's presented in certain ways through film, that it brings people to believe it, and it brings people to take it more seriously and to maybe believe it. And something that's kind of related to this is that as we see increases in technological advances in AI and CGI and things like that, more and more people are starting to say things like, well, if they can create it there in this film, then why can't they create it in terms of the more kind of like political or scientific messaging that's being put out about having visited the moon and footage of moonwalkings and so on. And so there are these interesting links going on between the way that information is portrayed through film, particularly as stories, as good stories, and coming to believe things which are pretty bizarre to believe, especially if you don't have them coming to you in a good story.
Fantastic. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thanks Kathleen, U-Wen, Nele and Joseph for participating, sharing your knowledge and expertise and interacting with the audience. It's been a really good experience and I've learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.